in Paul's epistles of those who had been sick and had not been healed. Even Paul talked about how he had prayed several times for relief from the thorn of the flesh, whatever that was. And God's response to the apostle was what? My grace is sufficient for you. You see, sometimes God says no, even when we are sick. But at the same time, what James is encouraging is he's saying, hey, we understand that's a given that God doesn't always say yes, but don't miss out on the opportunity. Pray for the sick, pray for those who suffer, because God does answer those prayers. God does heal the sick. He does relieve our suffering. But it's not cast as an absolute guarantee. If that were the case, I mean, keep in mind that every Christian who lived in this world before, let's say, just to be on the safe side, 1880 has died. Because Christians die. Not just unbelievers, but Christians die. And when Christians get sick, there are always Christians that pray for Christians that get sick. And at some point, the Christians die. And that was true of every apostle in the New Testament. There is no absolute guarantee that Christians are going to escape suffering, pain, and disease, and so on. We know that. But nevertheless, we still are to be encouraged because there's a massive impact from that prayer that God does at times heal people and restore them and also alleviates their suffering. Sometimes he says yes, sometimes he says no. Now, one of the things that's really misappropriated from this text is that James said it's the prayer of faith that will save the sick. And so we've had a whole theology emerge in the popular culture associated with so-called faith healing. So that if you are not rescued from your malady and delivered from your disease, then obviously the problem is you didn't have the faith. And if you have true faith, you'll never be sick, you'll always be cured, and so on. God always wills healing. You hear that kind of theology. You just have to name it and claim it, and so on. This is such a gross distortion of the total picture of what prayer is supposed to be and do in the Bible. I've had people tell me that if you pray for somebody and you say, if it be thy will, oh Lord, please raise this person up, that is a sin. It's an affront against God to say, if it is God's will, because God always wills that. I say, wait a minute. If it is a lack of faith to say, if it be thy will, what does that say about the posture of Christ's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane? The greatest teacher we have on how to pray is Christ himself. And when he was faced with his great passion, his ultimate suffering, that none of us can imagine what it was like to have the cup of God's wrath set before him. We can't imagine that. And he, in agony, sweating beads of blood, is on his face before God in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, O Lord, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Was that an act of unbelief on Jesus' part? By no means. And he hastened to add, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, which is also mentioned by James, those two little words, Deo volente. Don't say that you're going to do such something next week or next month or next year without saying at the same time, Deo volente. God willing, I will see you next week. But God may not be willing. God may take me between now and then. Or God may put me on my back and incapacitate me so that the plans that I have prepared for next week will not come to pass because God doesn't will it. You see, faithful prayer, true faith, what faith is in its essence is trust. And the prayer of faith is a prayer that trusts God for the outcome, even if he says no. That's what Jesus teaches us in Gethsemane. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. So that if you want me to take that cup, I'm going to trust you while I'm drinking the cup. That's the posture of Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And so again, we go back to the principle, the premise I've been repeating, that when we pray, remember who it is we're talking to. Remember who it is whose will is sovereign. And God's will does not always agree with my will. And aren't you glad? Because if it did, that would make me God. And I guarantee you, I would be an extremely poor substitute for the one who already holds that position. All right. So saying, if it be thy will, is not an act of unbelief. It is an act of trust. Trusting in God and in his will. Nevertheless, having said all of that, again, James will not allow us to retreat into fatalism, where we just say, que sera, sera, what will be, and I don't have to be engaged in serious prayers. But he goes on to say, the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man avails what? Everything? No, but it avails much. And that answers the question, does prayer change things? Yes. A whole lot of things. Does it avail for anything? Yes, it avails much. But again, he doesn't say the cavalier, casual, insipid prayer of an unrighteous person avails much. It's the fervent prayer that avails. And the fervent prayer of a righteous person relatively speaking. So what about fervency? Well, it's not that we have a Richter scale that measures the emotional intensity of every prayer, but fervency means praying with some degree of passion. And that passion should be in proportionate relationship to the severity of the need and the seriousness of the thing. It's not that we just scream and yell and carry on in church on Sunday morning so that we can exhibit passion over who's going to win the football game that afternoon. No. Passionate prayer should be fitting serious and severe needs. Now we see another commentary on the significance of the fervency of prayer in the parable of the unjust judge, or sometimes called the parable of the importunate widow. You remember the story. Jesus says there was a judge in a certain city who regarded neither God nor man. And there was this poor woman who had been wronged, and she came to the gate seeking justice. But the judge had no time for her. He was too busy. He didn't want to be bothered with her. But she kept knocking at his door. She kept asking to be heard. She persisted in her prayer until finally he couldn't stand it anymore. And just to get her off his back, to get rid of this pest, he heard her case and delivered her. And what does Jesus say? What's the point of the parable? Jesus doesn't say, oh, okay, just like this woman pestered this corrupt judge until she finally got what she wanted, so you have to pester the unjust judge who rules heaven and earth until you can finally get a hearing. That's not his point. His point is this: if even corrupt judges in this world from time to time will hear somebody's prayer, how much more will the true judge of heaven and earth, who has no corruption in him at all, hear your prayers? And he asked the rhetorical question, will not God vindicate his elect who cry out to him day and night. Again, Jesus is talking about the efficacy of prayer. In fact, at the beginning, we're told, and Jesus taught them a parable to the end, what? That men ought always to pray and not faint. That was the point of this parable. That's the point of this series, that we want to emphasize what Jesus taught in that parable, that we ought always to pray and not faint. And if we feel from time to time on the edge of fainting, if we feel like we're about to give up, the chances are we have been lax in our prayer, because there is a corollary between prayer and courage, prayer and hope. So the next time you're thinking of fainting, remember that the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous person avails much. And it is a mandate, but again, it is one of the greatest privileges that God has given his people, that we can come to him where no one else cares and nobody else wants to listen. He cares and he will listen.